The Park Café stood proudly in the heart of the city, an oasis of calm amidst the bustle of urban life. Nestled in the middle of a green park, the café was a symbol of luxury. The towering trees, their leaves a deep green, surrounded the space, and the sound of a fountain gently splashing added an air of tranquility to the atmosphere. The light streaming through the trees created patterns on the stone floor, making the entire café look like something out of a movie. The waiters moved efficiently between tables, each one dressed in a crisp black uniform, their presence almost invisible yet commanding. The scent of freshly baked bread mixed with the heady aroma of premium coffee filled the air, luring even the most jaded souls to pause and take in the moment. It was a place where the wealthy and powerful gathered, business moguls, socialites, artists, and influencers, all with one common purpose: to enjoy a quiet moment away from the chaos of their demanding lives. But among all the polished and poised faces that filled the café, there sat one man who didn't quite seem to fit in. Bernard Green, a man who had built his empire from scratch, sat alone at a table near the center of the room. His clothes, tailored, sharp, and perfectly pressed, spoke of a lifetime of success. He was not a man easily overlooked. His very presence commanded attention. But today, something was different. Bernard Green was not the usual confident, self-assured businessman. Today he looked weary. His normally vibrant blue eyes were dull, and his face, though still sharp, carried the burden of years of high-powered business dealings. As he stared at the menu, he seemed distracted, his thoughts far away from the selection of gourmet dishes. His fingers absent-mindedly traced the rim of his coffee cup, but he didn't drink it. Across from him sat his wife, Marissa. The age difference between them was noticeable. Bernard, in his early 70s, had married Marissa when she was much younger, an attractive woman with a body that still turned heads. She was dressed impeccably, her black dress with gold accents glimmering under the cafe's soft lighting. Her dark hair was swept back in a sophisticated style, and her flawless makeup gave her the appearance of someone who had just stepped out of a fashion magazine. But despite her beauty, there was something unsettling about her that day. Her smile, though present, felt forced. Her posture was perfect, but her eyes lacked the warmth they once had. Marissa wasn't paying attention to Bernard. In fact, she barely seemed to acknowledge his presence. Her focus was on her phone, her fingers moving quickly across the screen, typing something with a sense of urgency. Every now and then she would glance up, but only to check the room, her gaze lingering briefly on the men who passed by, before quickly returning to her device. The air between them was thick with unspoken tension. They had been married for several years now, but Bernard could feel the distance growing between them with each passing day. It wasn't just the age difference, nor was it the obvious disparity in their social circles. No, it was something deeper, something that couldn't be put into words. Outside the cafe, on the edge of the park, stood a figure, Malik. He was no more than 16, a boy whose worn-out clothes and scruffy appearance marked him as an outsider in this world of wealth and privilege. Malik's life had been anything but easy. Raised in the poorest corners of the city, he had never known comfort. He had spent most of his life fending for himself on the streets, always finding ways to survive. Yet even he could see the disparity between the rich and the poor. The Park Café, with its sleek tables and expensive decor, was a world he could only dream of being a part of. Today he stood outside the café, leaning against the wrought iron railing that separated the lush park from the upscale establishment. Malik wasn't there because he had any business in the café. No, he had seen something he couldn't ignore. As he had walked past the large glass windows of the café, something caught his attention. He had seen Bernard and Marissa sitting at their table, but it wasn't the couple that drew his gaze. It was Marissa's actions. He had watched her closely as she leaned in, her hand reaching into her designer handbag. There, in the dim light, he saw her pull out a small vial, a vial that looked suspiciously like the ones he had seen used in the shady underworld he had once been a part of. His heart had raced as he watched her open the vial and pour its contents into Bernard's soup. Malik didn't know what it was, but he could see enough to know that something was wrong. This wasn't a mistake. It wasn't some random occurrence. He had seen that vial in the hands of people he knew all too well, people who dealt in things they shouldn't have. And now Marissa was doing the same thing right there in the open. His breath quickened as he continued to watch. He knew he had to do something, but what? He was just a kid. No one would believe him. If he went inside and made a scene, he'd be thrown out. But at the same time, he couldn't just walk away. What if Bernard ate the soup and something happened to him? What if it was too late by then? Malik's thoughts were racing. He was about to turn and leave when he noticed that Bernard had picked up his spoon and was about to take a bite of the soup. The moment felt surreal. Time seemed to slow down and every muscle in his body screamed at him to act. Without thinking, he pushed himself off the railing and walked toward the entrance of the cafe. His heart pounded in his chest as he stepped inside. The air was thick with the smell of fresh bread and strong coffee, but all Malik could focus on was the table in front of him. "Don't eat that," he shouted, his voice cracking with anxiety. The entire cafe fell silent. Conversation stopped mid-sentence and people turned to look at the boy who had just burst into the room. Bernard's spoon froze mid-air. Marissa, startled, looked up, her face a picture of disbelief. "What did you say?" Marissa's voice was sharp, cutting through the tension like a knife. She stood up, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. Malik's throat was dry, but he pressed on. "She put something in your soup. I saw her do it." His words rushed out in a frantic torrent. The silence in the cafe deepened, and for a moment no one spoke. Bernard slowly set his spoon down, his gaze flicking between Malik and his wife. His eyes were wide with confusion, disbelief, and growing suspicion. "Marissa," Bernard said softly, his voice steady but laced with unease. "What is he talking about?" Marissa's face went pale. Her fingers trembled as she clenched her fists, the mask of composure slipping away. "You're lying," she spat, her voice dripping with contempt. "Why would I do that? This kid is just looking for attention. He doesn't know anything." But Malik stood his ground. "I saw you," he said firmly. "I saw you pour something into his soup. You can't lie your way out of this." The other patrons in the cafe were now whispering among themselves. Eyes darted between the three figures at the table. The atmosphere was tense, charged with anticipation. Everyone seemed to be waiting for someone, anyone, to speak up, to make sense of what was happening. Bernard's gaze softened for a moment as he looked at Marissa, but the doubt in his eyes was undeniable. "Marissa," he said again, his voice more insistent. "What's going on?" Marissa's hands clenched into fists at her sides. She was shaking now, her face flushed with anger and fear. "I said this is absurd," she shouted, her voice rising. "You'll believe some street rat over your wife? This is nothing but a sick game." But her words no longer carried the same weight they once had. Bernard's mind was racing. There was something in his gut telling him that Malik was telling the truth. Suddenly, one of the other patrons stood up, a man in a dark suit, his eyes wide with concern. "Is she trying to poison him?" he asked, his voice trembling slightly. "Is that what this kid is saying?" The question hung in the air, unanswered, as Bernard slowly stood from the table, his face pale. He looked down at the soup, the once steaming bowl now lukewarm, its contents suddenly seeming suspicious. The room held its collective breath as Bernard picked up the bowl and stared at it, his mind grappling with the enormity of the situation. In the chaos of those few moments, the cafe became a battleground. The polished veneer of luxury had cracked, revealing a dark undercurrent that no one had expected. And Malik, the boy who had once been invisible, had now become the center of attention, the one person brave enough to stand up when everyone else had chosen to look away.